The late August air hung thick and damp over Boston's South End, clinging to the ornate ironwork of the Victorian brownstones like a shroud. Inside number 47, Eleanor Vance moved through rooms she had meticulously designed, rooms that had once felt like a symphony of shared dreams but now echoed with a subtle, dissonant note. The air conditioning hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the oppressive humidity outside, yet a different kind of suffocation was beginning to press in on her. At 38, Eleanor was the creative force behind Vance & Vance Designs, a firm she and her husband, Rick, had built from a spare room dream into a respected name in Boston's competitive design world. Their brownstone, featured in Architectural Digest 2 years prior, was their flagship, a testament to Eleanor's eye for blending historic soul with modern elegance. Every restored molding, every carefully chosen fixture, every swatch of fabric whispered of a partnership she believed was as solid as the house's ancient foundations. Lately, though, the whispers had changed. Rick, usually so engaged, so effusive about their projects, had become a ghost in their meticulously curated life. His absences were longer, his explanations briefer. Seabreeze, he'd murmur, running a hand through his still boyish dark hair, the name of their ambitious eco-resort project on the Cape. Marcus is pushing hard. Investors are antsy. Marcus Hayes. The name conjured an image of shrewd eyes, a tailored suit, and a bank account that could make or break their firm's ascension to the next level. Marcus was their primary investor, a titan in Boston real estate, and his involvement in Seabreeze was meant to be their crowning achievement. Eleanor understood pressure. She lived it, breathed it. But this was different. Rick's stress felt performative. His eyes, when they met hers, skittered away too quickly. The easy laughter that had once filled their home had dwindled to a strained silence, punctuated by the tap-tap-tap of his fingers on his phone. A few weeks ago, at a fundraising gala for the Boston Athenaeum, she'd watched Rick with Sophia Hayes, Marcus's wife. Sophia, with her artfully tousled blonde hair and a smile that could charm a statue, had hung on Rick's every word. Eleanor had noted it, a fleeting prickle of unease, then dismissed it. Sophia was vivacious, a social butterfly. Rick was charming his investor's wife. It was business, albeit wrapped in Chanel and diamonds. She'd even exchanged pleasantries with Sophia, commenting on the surprisingly cool breeze coming off the harbor that evening, a brief respite from the city's clinging heat. Sophia's laughter was like wind chimes, light and musical, but her eyes, a startling shade of sapphire, had held a fleeting, unreadable expression when they'd rested on Eleanor. Eleanor remembered the texture of the velvet settee she'd perched on, the way the crystal chandelier refracted the light into 1,000 tiny rainbows, each one a pinpoint of distraction from the disquiet blooming in her chest. She'd told herself she was tired, overworked. Vance & Vance was on the cusp of something big. It was natural for tensions to run high. She was an expert at reading the subtle language of spaces, at discerning the unspoken desires of her clients. How, then, was she failing so profoundly to read the atmosphere of her own marriage? The brownstone, with its high ceilings and perfectly balanced color palettes, felt vast and empty when Rick wasn't there. And even when he was, a new kind of emptiness pervaded. He'd retreat to his study, the door pointedly ajar but creating a clear boundary, the glow of his laptop screen the only sign of life. Their conversations, once vibrant exchanges of ideas and affection, had become transactional. Did you call the contractor about the Beacon Hill kitchen? Don't forget we have the Henderson initial consult on Tuesday? The shared intimacy, the bedrock of their 15 years together, was eroding like sandstone in a relentless tide. Eleanor stood in their living room, a space of serene grays and blues, her hand resting on the cool marble of the fireplace mantel. A photo from their trip to Italy 5 years ago sat there. They were laughing, gelato in hand, the Tuscan sun illuminating their faces. They looked impossibly young, impossibly happy. A wave of something akin to grief washed over her. The memory felt like a scene from someone else's life. She tried to anchor herself in her work. At their Seaport District office, a sprawling, light-filled space in a converted warehouse, all exposed brick and polished concrete, she immersed herself in blueprints and fabric samples. The tangible nature of her job, the creation of beauty and order, was a balm. But even there, the disquiet followed. Rick was often out at meetings, his calendar increasingly vague. Their shared projects felt fractured, his input sporadic and disconnected. Their staff, loyal and perceptive, cast subtle, worried glances between them. the Seabreeze Eco Resort. It was supposed to be their masterpiece, a fusion of sustainable design and luxury that would put Vance & Vance Designs on the national map. Rick handled the financials, the investor relations, the big picture strategy. Eleanor helmed the aesthetic, the soul of the project. But lately, when she tried to discuss the interior concepts with him, his attention was elsewhere, his responses distracted. One sweltering Tuesday evening, Rick called to say he'd be late again. Another dinner with potential secondary investors for Seabreeze, he claimed. Eleanor ate a solitary meal of leftover pasta, the silence of the brownstone pressing in. She wandered into his study, a room she rarely entered. It was sleek, masculine, organized to a fault, or so she'd thought. An unfamiliar restlessness propelled her. She sat in his leather chair, the scent of his cologne, sandalwood and something citrusy, faint but present. On his usually clear desk, a high-end leather moleskine notebook lay open. A single unfamiliar initial, S, was looped elegantly at the top of a page filled with Rick's familiar scrawl, but the notes beneath were about restaurant reservations and weekend getaways, not projected ROIs or sustainability certifications. A cold dread, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through her. S. Sophia? No, it couldn't be. She was letting the oppressive heat and her own anxieties run wild. She closed the notebook, her hand trembling slightly. This was paranoia. She was tired. She needed to trust Rick, her partner, the man she had built her life with. But the seed of doubt, once planted, began to sprout, its tendrils wrapping around the carefully constructed edifice of her certainty. The dissonant note in her life was growing louder, threatening to shatter the symphony. The discovery, when it came, was not a dramatic confrontation or a whispered confession. It was a quiet, digital betrayal, delivered with the sterile impersonality of a cloud server. It was a Thursday morning. Rick had left early. A curt, "Marcus needs me on site at the proposed Seabreeze location," tossed over his shoulder as he'd grabbed his briefcase. The air in the brownstones still felt heavy with his hasty departure and the unspoken words hanging between them. Eleanor was at their office, trying to finalize the palette for a Back Bay penthouse, but her focus was fractured. The S in Rick's notebook haunted her. She needed a specific zoning document for the Seabreeze project, something Rick usually handled. He'd mentioned saving all critical project files to their shared business cloud account for transparency and backup. A bitter irony, she would later reflect. Navigating to the Seabreeze folder, her eye caught an unfamiliar subfolder, cryptically named Project Nightingale. Curiosity, or perhaps a more primal instinct for self-preservation, made her click. It wasn't password protected. Inside, there were no spreadsheets, no architectural renderings. Instead, there was a series of subfolders dated over the past 8 months. Her breath hitched. The first one she opened contained emails, not business emails. These were intimate, laced with a private language of longing and shared secrets. The sender, rhvance@vancedesigns.com. The recipient, sophia8globalnet.com. Sophia Hayes. The blood drained from Eleanor's face. The sleek lines of her ergonomic chair felt like a vice. The ambient noise of the office, the gentle hum of computers, the distant chatter of her team receded to a dull roar. Each word she read was a hammer blow, dismantling the reality she had inhabited. "My dearest S," one email from Rick began, dated 6 months prior. "Last night was transcendent. Being with you makes me feel alive in a way I'd forgotten. This sterile existence, you're the color in a monochrome world." Sterile existence. Monochrome world. Was that her? Their life? Sophia's replies were equally effusive, filled with desire and clandestine plans. I count the minutes, the little inn by the coast. Thursday? M thinks I'm at a charity luncheon. The delicious risk of it all. There were photos, Rick and Sophia, faces close, beaming, in settings Eleanor didn't recognize. A sun-drenched vineyard, a cozy-looking booth in a dimly lit bar, the pristine lobby of a boutique hotel. In one, Sophia wore a delicate gold necklace Eleanor had seen her wear at the Athenaeum Gala, the S, pendant glinting. That S. It wasn't a project initial, it was her. Then came the receipts. Scans of hotel bills from charming inns in Vermont and the Berkshires, flight confirmations for 2 to places like Charleston and Napa, always during times Rick had claimed to be on solo business trips or at industry conferences. He hadn't just been negligent or distant. He had been living an entirely separate, vibrant life, funded by their shared resources, built on a mountain of lies. The betrayal was a physical blow. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea, her hands trembling so violently she could barely control the mouse. It wasn't just infidelity. It was the depth of the deception, the calculated cruelty of it, the sheer audacity. He had looked her in the eye day after day while orchestrating this elaborate charade. He had touched her, slept beside her while his heart and mind were clearly elsewhere. Her meticulously ordered world, the one she curated with such precision and passion, had been a lie. She, Eleanor Vance, with her keen eye for detail and intuitive understanding of human nature, had been blind. The shame of that realization was as cutting as the betrayal itself. She closed the folder, her movements stiff, robotic. The vibrant fabric swatches on her desk suddenly seemed garish, the sophisticated design software on her screen an insult. How could she create beauty when her own life was so ugly, so profoundly shattered? Somehow, she made it through the rest of the workday. She delegated tasks, feigned a migraine, her face a pale, frozen mask. The drive home to the South End was a blur. The familiar streets, the graceful architecture of their neighborhood seemed alien, mocking. The brownstone, her sanctuary, her masterpiece, now felt like the scene of a crime. Rick arrived home around 8, feigning wariness. "Long day. Marcus is relentless," he said, loosening his tie, oblivious to the seismic shift that had occurred in Eleanor's world. He leaned in to kiss her cheek. Eleanor flinched, turning her head so his lips met only air. He paused, a flicker of something, annoyance, surprise in his eyes. "Everything okay, Elle?" The dam of her composure, so carefully maintained all day, finally broke. The words, when they came, were not a shout, but a low, trembling accusation. "Project Nightingale. Rick, what is Project Nightingale?" His face went slack, then pale. For a moment, he looked utterly lost, the charming facade crumbling to reveal the startled guilt beneath. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Eleanor's voice was dangerously quiet. She walked over to their shared iMac in the kitchen alcove, her fingers flying over the keyboard, navigating to the cloud server, to the folder, to the emails, the photos, the receipts. She turned the large screen towards him. This is what I'm talking about with Sophia Hayes. For 8 months, while you were supposedly building our future, you were this." Rick stared at the screen, his carefully constructed world imploding before his eyes. The color drained completely from his face. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Denial was impossible. The evidence was stark, overwhelming. "Ellie, it's not what it looks like," he stammered, the words hollow, absurd in the face of the digital reality glowing from the monitor. "Not what it looks like?" A laugh, sharp and brittle, escaped Eleanor's lips. "Oh, I think it's exactly what it looks like, Rick. It looks like you've systematically betrayed every vow we ever made, every dream we ever shared. It looks like you've made a fool of me." Her voice began to shake uncontrollably. "A sterile existence? A monochrome world? Is that what I am to you?" He finally met her gaze, his eyes filled with a desperate, panicked energy. "No, Ellie, of course not. It happened. It didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" she whispered, the sheer audacity of his minimization stealing her breath. 8 months of secret trips, intimate exchanges, stolen moments, all amounting to nothing? "It meant enough for you to lie to me every single day. It meant enough for you to risk everything we've built, our marriage, our business." "I can explain." "Explain what, Rick?" Eleanor's voice rose, fueled by a torrent of pain and fury. "Explain how you looked me in the eye and lied? Explain how you could be so deceitful, so cruel? Explain how I was supposed to just keep designing pretty rooms while you were off living this sordid double life?" He reached for her, his hand outstretched. "Ellie, please. Let's talk about this. We can fix this." She recoiled as if burned. Fix this? The idea was ludicrous. Something had shattered within her, something so fundamental that the thought of repair was inconceivable. "There's nothing to fix, Rick. There's just this ugliness, this truth." He tried again, his tone shifting to a pleading, almost pathetic whine. "It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. I love you, Ellie. You know I do." The words, once the cornerstone of her world, now sounded like a foreign language, devoid of meaning. Love? This wasn't love. This was a profound disrespect, a violation of everything she held sacred. "I don't know what I know anymore, Rick," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. The initial storm of fury had passed, leaving behind a desolate, icy calm. "But I know this. I can't look at you. I can't be in this house with you." She turned and walked towards the bedroom, their bedroom, now a monument to his betrayal. She packed a small overnight bag, her movements jerky, uncoordinated. Rick followed her, babbling excuses, apologies, promises. She didn't hear him. The sounds were just noise, the buzzing of an insect trapped against a window pane. When she walked out of the brownstone into the humid Boston night, she didn't look back. The beautiful, historic facade seemed to loom over her, a silent, reproachful witness. She had no destination in mind, only a desperate need escaped the suffocating weight of Rick's betrayal and the ruins of the life she thought was hers. The first call she made, hands shaking as she hailed a cab, was to Chloe in New York. The city lights blurred through her tears, each one a splinter in her shattered heart. The first few days were a blur of numb disbelief and raw, visceral pain. Eleanor found refuge in a sterile, anonymous hotel room overlooking the Charles River, the city lights reflecting like cold, distant stars on the water. Sleep was a fleeting, tormented visitor, chased away by a relentless reel of images. Rick and Sophia, laughing, touching, the damning words of their emails, the cheerful, oblivious faces of her staff at Vance & Vance. Chloe was her lifeline. Her voice, crackling over the phone line from New York, was a steady anchor in the storm. "Ellie, breathe," Chloe had said, her tone firm but laced with deep affection. "He's a bastard, a world-class, grade-A bastard, but you are not going to let him destroy you. Do you hear me?" Eleanor heard her, but the words felt distant, academic. Destroyed felt like an understatement. Her entire identity, wife, partner, co-founder, had been built on a foundation of lies. Who was she, if not those things? The hotel room, with its generic art and impersonal furnishings, felt like a metaphor for her current state. Unmoored, stripped bare. The anger, when it finally began to surface through the shock and grief, was a slow burn, a quiet fury that settled deep in her bones. It was different from the explosive rage of that first confrontation. This was colder, more focused. Rick's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a violation of their professional partnership, a mockery of the years of hard work and sacrifice they had both poured into Vance & Vance Designs. And Sophia, the elegant, charming Sophia, a woman who had smiled at Eleanor, shaken her hand, all while sleeping with her husband. The dual betrayal from her husband and from a woman within their professional circle was a particularly bitter pill. Chloe's advice was pragmatic. You need a lawyer, Ellie, a shark, and you need to protect yourself financially and legally. He's shown you who he is. Believe him. Protect herself. The words resonated. As the initial shockwaves subsided, Eleanor's designer mind, the one that thrived on order and problem-solving, began to stir. Rick had been careless, arrogant. He'd left a digital trail. What else had he been careless about? A week after the discovery, fueled by a potent cocktail of grief, anger, and a burgeoning, steely resolve, Eleanor walked back into the Seaport District office of Vance & Vance Designs. She hadn't told Rick where she was staying, communicating only through terse texts about urgent business matters. Seeing him there, looking harried and attempting a semblance of normalcy, was like looking at a stranger. He tried to approach her, his face etched with a mixture of anxiety and a plea for reconciliation. Eleanor cut him off with a cool, professional tone that brooked no argument, discussing only an urgent client deadline. The chasm between them was now a vast, unbridgeable canyon. She was still a co-owner. She still had full access to their servers, their accounts, their project files. The Project Nightingale folder had been a Pandora's box of personal deceit. What if Rick's deceptions ran deeper, bleeding into the business itself? The Seabreeze Eco-Resort project, his supposed obsession, the one that had provided the perfect cover for his affair, a sudden, chilling thought struck her. Had it all been a cover? Or was there more to it? Her quiet fury found a new focus. During the evenings, in the sterile anonymity of her hotel room, and during stolen hours at the office when Rick was out, Eleanor began to dig. Not for more evidence of the affair, she had more than enough of that, but into the financial underpinnings of Vance & Vance, specifically everything related to the Seabreeze project. She was meticulous, her designer's eye for detail now applied to spreadsheets, invoices, and bank transfers. It started with small discrepancies. Inflated expense reports for Rick's solo business trips, payments to consultants she'd never heard of for services vaguely described. Then she found larger, more alarming irregularities. The Seabreeze project involved multiple investors, complex financing, and a labyrinth of shell corporations, standard for large developments. But Rick had always been opaque about the specifics, waving off her questions with jargon and assurances that he had it all under control. Now, Eleanor saw that his control might have been an illusion, or worse, a deliberate manipulation. She uncovered a series of wire transfers from the primary Seabreeze development account, an account heavily funded by Marcus Hayes, to an offshore entity in the Cayman Islands. The amounts weren't colossal individually, but they added up over months, totaling a significant sum. The beneficiary company, Nightingale Holdings Limited, screamed at her from the transaction records. Project Nightingale. It wasn't just the affair's code name, it was a financial black hole. Her blood ran cold. Was Rick siphoning funds? Embezzling? The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about a broken marriage anymore. This was fraud. This could bring down everything, not just their firm, but potentially implicate Marcus Hayes, who had placed immense trust and capital in Rick's hands. The moral weight of her discovery was immense. Her first instinct, a primal urge, was to burn it all down, expose Rick for the cheat and the thief he was. Let him face the full consequences. But then came the chilling realization. Vance & Vance was her creation too. Her name was on it. Her reputation, her financial security were inextricably linked to it. Destroying Rick might mean destroying herself. And what about Marcus? An innocent victim in all of this, betrayed by both his wife and his business partner. Sleepless nights were now spent staring at the ceiling, her mind a maelstrom of conflicting emotions and terrifying possibilities. She confided the financial findings to Chloe, her voice trembling as she laid out the evidence. "Oh, Ellie," Chloe breathed, the usual wisecracks absent. This is big. Bigger than big. You need to be so careful." "What do I do, Chloe?" Eleanor whispered, feeling utterly overwhelmed. "If I expose him, the company is finished. My career, everything I've worked for. But if I don't, Marcus will be ruined, and Rick will get away with it. How can I live with that?" "This is where Dr. Reed comes in," Chloe said gently but firmly. She'd been urging Eleanor to see a therapist, someone to help her navigate the emotional minefield. "And Frank Peterson, that lawyer I told you about. You need expert advice, Ellie, not just mine." Eleanor took a deep breath. Chloe was right. She couldn't do this alone. The next day, she made 2 calls. The first was to Dr. Evelyn Reed, a therapist specializing in trauma and relationship crises whose name Chloe had given her. The second was to James Peterson, a renowned Boston litigator. Her first session with Dr. Reed was like lancing a festering wound. Eleanor, usually so composed, found herself weeping, articulating the depth of her pain, her rage, her confusion. Dr. Reed listened patiently, her calm presence a steadying force. "Eleanor," she said, her voice gentle but direct, "you've experienced a profound trauma, a betrayal on multiple levels. It's okay to feel everything you're feeling, the anger, the grief, the desire for justice. Our work will be to help you find a path through this that aligns with your integrity, even if it's an incredibly difficult one." Integrity. The word resonated. What did integrity demand of her now? James Peterson, the lawyer, was all sharp angles and sharper questions. He listened to her account of the affair and the financial irregularities without a flicker of emotion, his gaze intense. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice crisp, "you have a very strong case for divorce and grounds for significant claims. Regarding the financial misconduct, this is serious, potentially criminal. You have a responsibility to consider your own liability as a partner, right? However unwitting, and you have a moral obligation regarding Mr. Hayes." He laid out her options, stark and unpalatable. She could try to negotiate a quiet divorce, attempt to salvage what she could from the business, perhaps try to force Rick out. Or she could expose everything, cooperate with Marcus Hayes, and face the ensuing storm, whatever it might bring. "The path of least immediate resistance," Peterson noted, "often leads to the greatest long-term regret, especially when matters of principle are at stake." Eleanor left Peterson's office feeling both terrified and strangely clarified. The quiet fury within her was solidifying into a grim resolve. Rick had not just broken her heart, he had defiled their shared creation, jeopardized the trust of an innocent man, and potentially committed serious crimes. He had leveraged their business, her talent, her name, to fund his deceptions. The image of Marcus Hayes, stern but fair, a man who had believed in them, in Rick, kept returning to her. He deserved to know the truth. Not just about his wife, but about the viper he'd welcomed into his business dealings. The decision, when it crystallized, felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. The humid Boston summer was giving way to the crisp, clear air of early autumn. The leaves in the public garden were just beginning to turn, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the darkness she was wading through. She would not be a silent accomplice to Rick's corruption. She would not let him get away with it. The cost to herself would be immense, she knew. But the cost of inaction, the erosion of her own soul, would be far greater. She began to meticulously document everything, creating a detailed dossier of the affair and the financial malfeasance, her movements precise, her focus unwavering. The pain was still there, a constant ache beneath the surface, but now it was overlaid with a cold, hard purpose. Rick, still trying to bridge the chasm between them, with pathetic overtures of remorse and talk of saving the business, was oblivious to the storm she was about to unleash. He saw her renewed focus, her long hours at the office, and mistook it for a willingness to move forward, to salvage Vance and Vance. He couldn't have been more wrong. Eleanor Vance was preparing for war. The opportunity presented itself with an almost theatrical sense of timing. Marcus Hayes was hosting an exclusive pre-launch event for the Seabreeze Eco Resort, a high-stakes presentation for a select group of secondary investors and influential media. It was to be held in a sleek event space in the Intercontinental Boston, overlooking the harbor. Rick, naturally, was slated to be the keynote speaker, the charismatic visionary unveiling their masterpiece. He had been practicing his speech for weeks, his usual confidence amplified by nervous energy, Eleanor now recognized as the hallmark of his deceptions. Eleanor knew this was her moment. The symbolism was potent. Rick, poised to deliver yet another performance built on lies, would instead face an unscripted reality. In the days leading up to the event, Eleanor moved with a chilling calm. She finalized her dossier, printouts of the emails between Rick and Sophia, copies of the illicit receipts, and damning spreadsheets detailing the flow of funds from the Seabreeze account to Nightingale Holdings Limited, complete with transaction dates and account numbers. She cross-referenced everything, her work as precise as any design blueprint she'd ever drafted. Each page was a testament to Rick's duplicity, a nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed image. She confided her plan to Chloe, who listened with a mixture of apprehension and awe. "Are you sure, Ellie? There's no going back from this." "I know," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "There's no going back anyway, Chloe. This is just choosing which direction to face." Doctor. Reed had helped her process the immense emotional toll, reminding her that choosing truth, however painful, was an act of self-respect. James Peterson had advised her on the legal parameters, ensuring her actions were defensible. On the evening of the presentation, Eleanor dressed with deliberate care. Not in mourning black, but in a tailored cream pantsuit, a color that spoke of clarity and resolve. Her reflection in the mirror was a stranger, paler, thinner, her eyes shadowed with a grief that had become a permanent resident, but also glinting with an unyielding determination. Rick, oblivious, was a bundle of pre-show nerves and false bonhomie. "You look incredible, Elle," he said, attempting a supportive smile as they prepared to leave the brownstone, a place she now visited only for such joint appearances, spending her nights in an extended-stay apartment she'd quietly rented. "Tonight's big. For us." "Yes, Rick," she agreed, her tone neutral. "It is." The event space buzzed with an air of expensive anticipation. Waiters circulated with champagne, and the low hum of conversation was punctuated by expectant laughter. Marcus Hayes, looking distinguished and every bit the magnate, greeted key arrivals. Sophia was by his side, radiant in a sapphire blue gown, her smile flawless. She caught Eleanor's eye and offered a polite, almost pitying nod, as if to an acquaintance facing a minor inconvenience. The audacity was breathtaking. Eleanor waited. She watched Rick schmooze, his charm turned up to full wattage. He was in his element, the consummate performer. She felt a distant, almost clinical detachment, the raw edges of her pain momentarily cauterized by the cold fire of her purpose. The presentation began. Marcus Hayes delivered a brief, powerful introduction, his voice resonating with pride in the Seabreeze project. Then he gestured towards the podium. "And now, the man whose vision has been instrumental in bringing Seabreeze to life, my partner, Richard Vance." As applause rippled through the room and Rick began to rise, his face alight with a triumphant smile, Eleanor made her move. She didn't cause a scene. There were no shouts, no public accusations. Instead, she approached Marcus Hayes, who was stepping away from the podium. "Marcus," she said, her voice low but clear, "I apologize for the interruption, but there's something of critical importance you need to see. Immediately. It concerns Rick and the Seabreeze project." Marcus, surprised by her directness and the uncharacteristic intensity in her eyes, hesitated. He saw the thick manila envelope in her hand. "Eleanor, what is this?" "Evidence, Marcus," she said, meeting his gaze unflinchingly, "of a profound betrayal, both personal and professional." Something in her demeanor, her utter conviction, cut through his initial skepticism. He glanced towards Rick, who was now standing at the podium, waiting for the room to settle. With a curt nod, Marcus led Eleanor to a small, private anteroom just off the main hall. Inside, under the harsh glare of recessed lighting, Eleanor laid out the contents of the envelope on a polished mahogany table. She spoke calmly, concisely, walking him through the affair with his wife Sophia, supported by the emails and photos. Marcus's face, already stern, hardened into a mask of disbelief, then dawning fury. His complexion turned ashen. He sank heavily into a chair, his breathing audible. "And this," Eleanor continued, her voice devoid of triumph, only a deep, resonant sorrow as she presented the financial documents, "is Nightingale Holdings Limited. This is where a significant portion of your investment in Seabreeze has been diverted by Rick." Marcus stared at the spreadsheets, his formidable composure visibly cracking. The numbers, the dates, the familiar signature of Rick Vance on transfer authorizations, it was undeniable. The silence in the small room was deafening, broken only by the muffled sound of Rick's voice beginning his presentation in the hall next door. "Sophia," Marcus whispered, his voice raw with a pain that mirrored Eleanor's own. Then his gaze, cold and diamond-hard, lifted to meet hers. "And Rick, my partner." He stood, his movements stiff. He picked up one of the incriminating bank statements, his knuckles white. Without a word, he strode out of the anteroom and back into the main hall, just as Rick was hitting his stride, painting a glowing picture of Seabreeze's potential. Marcus walked directly to the podium. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held up the bank statement. "Rick," he said, his voice carrying an icy authority that cut through Rick's polished rhetoric, silencing the room. "Perhaps you'd care to explain this transaction? And your connection to Nightingale Holdings Limited?" Rick froze mid-sentence. His smile vanished. He stared at the document in Marcus's hand, then at Marcus's thunderous expression, then his eyes darted wildly around the room, finally landing on Eleanor, who stood quietly by the doorway of the anteroom. In her gaze, he saw not hatred, but a profound, irrevocable finality. The color drained from Rick's face. He stammered, "Marcus, this isn't the time or place." "On the contrary, Rick," Marcus bit out, his voice like steel, "this is precisely the time and place." He turned to the stunned audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that this presentation is canceled. It appears there are significant irregularities with the Seabreeze project and with Mr. Vance's conduct that require immediate investigation." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Sophia Hayes, standing near the front, looked as if she'd been struck. Her eyes, wide with panic, locked onto Rick's, then flickered towards Eleanor, a dawning horror in their depths. Rick's world, so carefully constructed, so artfully presented, crumbled in that instant. The investors looked confused, then alarmed. The media representatives scented a scandal. He stood at the podium, exposed and utterly alone, the spotlight no longer a warmth but a searing, unforgiving glare. His carefully rehearsed words about vision and integrity now hung in the air like a bad joke. Eleanor watched, not with satisfaction but with a heavy heart. This was not victory, it was a necessary demolition. The crashing down of Rick Vance had begun, and in the ensuing silence, punctuated only by Marcus Hayes' curt dismissal of the bewildered guests, Eleanor knew that her own life, too, had irrevocably changed. The gilded cage had been shattered, and she was beshen. The fallout was swift and brutal. Marcus Hayes, a man of immense influence and decisive action, moved with surgical precision. Within days, Vance & Vance Designs was effectively shuttered, its assets frozen pending a forensic audit. Lawyers descended. News of the scandal, initially whispered in Boston's tight-knit business circles, soon erupted in the local financial press. Prominent Boston design firm implodes amidst allegations of fraud and infidelity. Rick's name was Mud. His photo, once accompanying articles on rising entrepreneurs, now illustrated stories of disgrace. Sophia Hayes vanished from the social scene. Whispers suggested Marcus had presented her with an ultimatum, a quiet, very private divorce or public ruin. Whatever the terms, her glittering world had been irrevocably tarnished. For Rick, the descent was catastrophic. He faced not only professional annihilation, but also the looming threat of criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. His charm, once his greatest asset, was useless against the cold, hard evidence Eleanor had provided. He tried to reach out to Eleanor, leaving desperate, rambling voicemails filled with self-pity, blame, and pathetic pleas for her to stop this madness. She never responded. James Peterson handled all communication. Eleanor, meanwhile, was navigating her own personal deconstruction. The victory of Rick's exposure felt hollow, heavy. There was no elation, only a profound, aching grief for the life she had lost, the man she thought she knew, and the dreams that had turned to ash. The process of dismantling their shared existence was excruciating. Filing for divorce was a sterile, legalistic severing of a bond she had once believed inviolable. Liquidating their assets, the art, the furniture, the carefully curated objects that had once defined their shared taste, felt like auctioning off pieces of her soul. The hardest part was selling the South End brownstone. Walking through its empty rooms for the last time, rooms that had echoed with laughter, arguments, love, and ultimately betrayal, was an exercise in exquisite pain. Each familiar detail, from the custom millwork to the sun-drenched bay window in the master bedroom, was a fresh stab to the heart. It was no longer a home. It was a mausoleum of dead dreams. She leaned heavily on Chloe, whose calls and occasional weekend visits from New York were a lifeline of sanity and unwavering support. "You did the right thing, Ellie," Chloe would say, her voice firm. "The incredibly hard, incredibly brave thing. Don't ever doubt that." Her sessions with Dr. Reed became an essential refuge. In the quiet, safe space of the therapist's office, Eleanor slowly began to unpack the complex layers of her trauma. The betrayal, yes, but also her own complicity in maintaining an illusion, her fear of confronting the cracks in her marriage long before the chasm opened. "You're grieving not just the marriage you had, Eleanor," Dr. Reed observed gently one afternoon as the autumn leaves swirled outside the window, "but the marriage you thought you had, the future you envisioned. That's a profound loss." Eleanor also had to confront the reactions of her parents. Her mother, Carol, initially struggled, her anxieties colored by a generational concern for what people will think and a desperate hope for reconciliation. "Are you sure, dear? Marriage is about forgiveness, too," she'd ventured hesitantly over the phone. It was her father, Frank, the retired architect, quieter and more reserved, who finally cut through the well-meaning but misplaced advice. During a difficult visit to their coastal Maine home, where Eleanor had retreated for a few weeks of raw, unadulterated grief, he sat with her on the porch overlooking the steely gray November ocean. "Your mother means well, Ellie," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But she doesn't understand the structural failure here. You can't rebuild on a rotten foundation. You did what you had to do to save yourself from the collapse." His quiet validation was a balm to her bruised spirit. In Maine, surrounded by the stark beauty of the late autumn coastline, Eleanor found a fragile solace. The raw, wind-swept landscape mirrored her internal state. She walked for hours along the rocky shore, the salty air stinging her face, the rhythmic crash of waves a primal comfort. And slowly, tentatively, she began to sketch again. Not for clients, not for a project, but for herself. Quick, impressionistic renderings of the gnarled pines, the turbulent sea, the shifting light. It was a small act of reclamation, a whisper of the creative self that had been silenced by the trauma. The legal proceedings dragged on. Rick, stripped of his assets and facing mounting legal bills, was a shadow of his former self. Marcus Hayes, true to his reputation, pursued the financial recovery with relentless determination, but he also, in a private communication relayed through lawyers, acknowledged Eleanor's courage in bringing the truth to light, offering a surprisingly respectful, albeit distant, form of closure on that front. The Boston winter settled in, cold and unforgiving. Eleanor moved into a small, rented apartment in Cambridge, across the river from the life she once knew. It was sparsely furnished, chosen for its anonymity and its large windows that let in the pale winter light. The deconstruction was nearly complete. The old life was gone, razed to the ground. Now, standing in the cleared space, amidst the dust and debris, Eleanor faced the terrifying, liberating question: what next? The anger was still there, a dull ember, but it was no longer the consuming fire it had once been. Beneath it, something else was beginning to stir, a flicker of exhaustion, yes, but also a nascent, fragile sense of peace. The worst was over. She had survived 18 months. It felt like a lifetime had passed since that catastrophic evening at the Intercontinental. The sharp edges of grief had softened, though the scars remained, intricate traceries on her soul, reminders of the devastation. The Boston skyline, viewed from her Cambridge apartment window, no longer seemed to mock her with memories of what was lost. Instead, it represented a familiar landscape, one she was slowly, cautiously beginning to re-engage with on her own terms. Eleanor Vance's design studio was a modest affair, run from a sun-drenched spare bedroom in her apartment. There were no sleek Seaport District offices, no bustling team of assistants. Just Eleanor, her drafting table, her laptop, and a quiet, rekindled passion for her craft. She took on smaller projects, a Back Bay pied-à-terre for a discerning academic, a historic farmhouse renovation in Concord for a young family. These projects were less about grand statements and more about creating spaces that felt authentic, lived in, and deeply personal. The work was grounding, healing. Each completed design was a small act of rebuilding, not just for her clients, but for herself. The legal battles had largely concluded. Rick, convicted of several counts of fraud, was serving a prison sentence. The name Vance & Vance Designs was a footnote in Boston business history. Marcus Hayes had recovered a portion of his losses, and his own life, Eleanor heard through the grapevine, was slowly finding a new, albeit altered, rhythm. Sophia had quietly relocated, her name fading from even the most persistent gossip columns. Eleanor had found a new equilibrium. It wasn't the vibrant, ambitious life she'd once shared with Rick, but it was hers. Wholly, authentically hers. She was more reserved now, her trust given more carefully, her observations of the world more nuanced. The trauma had stripped away a certain naivete, but it had also unearthed a profound inner strength she hadn't known she possessed. Her friendship with Chloe remained a constant, a source of laughter and unwavering support. They spoke almost daily, their bond forged even stronger in the crucible of Eleanor's crisis. "You're blooming, Ellie," Chloe said during one video call, noticing the subtle shift in Eleanor's demeanor, a lightness in her eyes, a hint of a smile that reached them. Quietly, but definitely blooming. Her relationship with her parents had also evolved. Her mother, Carol, had come to understand in her own way the depth of Rick's betrayal and the necessity of Eleanor's actions. There was a new respect in her voice, a recognition of her daughter's resilience. Frank's quiet pride remained a steady, reassuring presence. Dr. Reed's office was a place Eleanor still visited, though less frequently. Their conversations now focused more on navigating the future than on dissecting the past. "You've learned that your identity is not contingent on a partner, or a company, or a particular lifestyle," Dr. Reed had said in their last session. "It resides within you." That's a powerful realization, Eleanor. One crisp October afternoon, almost 2 years after the reckoning, Eleanor sat at her drafting table, the mellow autumn sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating the specks of dust dancing in the air. She was sketching ideas for a small community arts center, a pro bono project she'd taken on. A genuine smile touched her lips as a particularly elegant solution for the entryway came to her. Her phone buzzed. A text from Chloe. "Thinking of you. Saw the most hideous orange sofa today. Totally something Rick would have tried to sell you on in the early days. Made me laugh. You free for a call later?" Eleanor chuckled, a light, easy sound. The memory of Rick, though still carrying a faint ache, no longer had the power to cripple her. It was part of her story, a dark chapter, but not the whole book. She looked out the window at the familiar outline of the Boston skyline. The city that had been the backdrop to her greatest successes and her deepest despair now felt like a quiet companion on her journey. There was no grand cinematic triumph, no dramatic new romance. Instead, there was a hard-won peace, a quiet sense of self-possession. The lessons had been brutal, etched into her being. Lessons about the deceptive nature of appearances, the fragility of trust, the corrosive power of lies. But also, lessons about her own resilience, the strength found in integrity, and the profound relief of living authentically, even if that authenticity was born from wreckage. She picked up her pencil, the smooth wood familiar in her hand. The reclaimed canvas of her life stretched before her, no longer pristine, but marked, textured, and infinitely more interesting. She wasn't just designing spaces anymore. She was designing a life, her life, on her own terms, one thoughtful line, one deliberate choice at a time. And for Eleanor Vance, that was more than enough. It was everything.